Trump's fate is in the hands of a jury. Deliberations are happening right this moment. Let's talk about the closing arguments and the potential political fallout of all the different possible outcomes here. No gag order in the classified documents case. Is there any chance at all that this trial happens prior to November? And if it doesn't, will it really matter at all? Alito's new defense in Flaggate is that his wife is just super into flags of all types, and he's not so much a fan of flags. Also, the neighbor thing again, but it turns out that's bull. Anyway, we'll get to it. Welcome back to the podcast for the 54% of Americans who regularly vote for progress in every election and want to convince their friends and family members to join our majority. This is Majority 54.
All right, Jason. Well, as we speak, the jury is deliberating in this Trump case. They could, theoretically, I think they break at 4:30 today. So 2.5 hours from when we are recording. We are recording at 2:04 p.m. Eastern time on Wednesday. And we could have a verdict by the time we finish this podcast. Although there's so many counts, I would be surprised if that happened. I think the way to look at this, and I do want to get into the closing arguments because I think they're really interesting. And then we'll talk about a little bit about the jury instructions. But before any of that, I think it's worth thinking about, well, what are the different scenarios here, right? And how do we read the tea leaves? One is that we get a quick verdict. That is almost certainly bad news for Trump. That means that you've got unanimous guilty, probably on all counts, I would imagine, if it were quick. So today, maybe even tomorrow, that is bad news for Trump. The longer this goes, the better the news is for Trump. That's how you need to just read the information. That means that there is some kind of dispute within this jury over something. Now, it could drag on for days, and then they come back and they say, well, we are hung on a few of these charges, but by and large, we are in agreement on most of them. Still bad news for Trump. I just wanted to get that out of the way because I think this will be the speculation over the next few days if we don't hear back very soon.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we are pretty sure is not going to happen is not guilty on all counts. It's just hard to imagine. And so, which to your point about why a quick verdict would be bad, because it would mean that they're like, yeah, dude is guilty. He's guilty of everything. Let's go home. I don't think that's going to happen super fast, but it's possible. Clearly what they want is what the Trump defense was trying to do was to just zero in on, get one juror to hang and say, I can't find him guilty, and just refuse to give up any ground. So that's what they're pulling for, which could happen.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning, and we're going to go into our sort of analysis based on what we know of the closing arguments and the evidence that was left standing at the end of this trial. But this is so subjective, right? There's 12 people. The Trump team only needs to convince one of those people to have reasonable doubt as to one of the elements of the crime. And the crime, although there are lots of counts, they're kind of all talking about the same thing, right? So, and there's also the fact that this is about Donald Trump. And I know it's Manhattan, but the chances of one of 12 people having strong feelings that are different than our strong feelings about Trump are pretty high, even in Manhattan, right?
I'd say, it very high. Like, it's 12 people in Manhattan. In my mind, there's a greater than 90% chance that one of the people on that jury voted twice for Trump.
Yeah. And so, or they're just somebody who doesn't vote and has those feelings, right? Or somebody who even voted Democratic, these people exist. Manhattan is, I think everybody looks at it as like this super liberal place, but it is a place that, my dad ran for state Senate in Manhattan as a MAGA Republican, and I haven't looked it up, but I'm sure he got thousands of votes, right? So like, reflexive Republican votes. So with that out of the way, closing arguments wrapped up, and I've been spending the past 24 hours listening to people from across the legal spectrum size up these closing arguments, because I am not a criminal lawyer. You were a civil lawyer, so you have more of a sense of what closing arguments are all about. Trump's team went first, Todd Blanche, his lawyer, and then the prosecutors got to close, which is the law in New York. And I'm trying to place most emphasis on the people who were in the room. There are people like Harry Littman, who has a decent podcast about this kind of stuff, and has he's been tweeting about all of this. The people in the room have more of a sort of sense of the body language and how things are going down and all of that. And my sense here is that the Trump team did not close strong. I don't know if that's your sense. It seems like they were a bit erratic in their closing arguments, whereas it seems by all accounts the prosecutors were fairly thorough and organized. And I couldn't find a single person who felt the defense had a stronger closing than the prosecution.
Well, look, you can only work with what you have. And the prosecution put together a case because they had an enormous amount of evidence in their favor. The defense didn't. I mean, there's a reason that they barely put on a case of their own. They relied almost entirely, save for a couple of witnesses, on cross-examining the prosecution's witnesses and just trying to raise the possibility of doubt as a result. So when you think about what a closing argument is, closing arguments are really exciting. They're really dramatic. They are, when we think about courtroom drama, we think about two things. The first thing we think about is witness testimony and cross-examination. That's, when you think about films about courtroom dramas, it's always catching someone in a lie or presenting them with surprise evidence, that kind of thing. But right behind that is closing arguments, because the way the rules work is that closing arguments are where, as long as something is in evidence, it's an argument, right? That's why openings are opening statements, not opening arguments. The closing is, now I get to take all this stuff that's in the record and I get to tell you what I want you to believe about it. I get to tell you my argument as to how you should interpret this evidence that's in the record. And it's exciting. And as you go through the trial and there's testimony, you write down, if you're a lawyer, on your notepad, the arguments you're going to make about the evidence, right? And that's not stuff you're going to do during the witness testimony. That's what you're going to do in the arguments. And so for the prosecution, they were able to put together this timeline and that's their job, is to tell a story. I mean, they're basically trying to make a case about this being a conspiracy to, violate these other laws using these fraudulent document laws. And so to do that, you have to tell the story, and you have to tell an airtight story that makes sense and say, this happened and then this happened, and this is what the defendant was thinking. This is what their motivation was at this time. And you've got to really lay that out. For the defense, remember, it's a different standard. Just create reasonable doubt. I mean, the classic example that everybody remembers is, if the glove does not fit, you must acquit. The OJ lawyers didn't go out and present their own timeline during their closing. They didn't have a completely alternative set of possibilities. They just zeroed in on one thing and said, if this thing gives you doubt, then you can't do any of this. You can't convict on any of it. And that is what the defense is trying to do. And they clearly zeroed in on the testimony of Michael Cohen and said, look, our best chance here is to make the argument that if you think that Michael Cohen is not trustworthy, or you have doubts about Michael Cohen, then that should translate to enough doubt to acquit, right? What is the thing about which we can sow the most doubt? Well, the accomplice who testified against the defendant and who has been convicted of lying under oath before. I believe that's what he's convicted of, right? For Trump, by the way, we should say. But still, so they clearly said, this is the best place for us to put all our money on the roulette wheel.
Well, what's interesting is, I was listening to Preet Bharara's assessment of this, and he wasn't in the room, but he's just going off of the transcript. And he's the former U.S. attorney for the Southern District, for people who are listening. And he said he was surprised by the fact that Blanche, Trump's attorney, in the closing argument, but also in his opening statement, did what Bharara called shifting the burden, meaning the defense is entitled to reasonable doubt, right? And that's what you want to hang your hat on, is to say, look, all you need is a reasonable doubt. And what Preet was saying was, he was surprised along the way, and even in the closing arguments, that the defense kept making statements like Trump is innocent, he did not have sex with Stormy Daniels, and things like that, where they're like implying, and in some cases just outright stating, that Trump did not do any of the conduct that was alleged. And Bharara was saying, this is a this is one of the worst things you can do as a defense attorney, is to shift the burden, because he was left with the impression, based on what he read and what he's heard, that the defense was operating under this assumption that they need to prove Trump's innocence, which is not their job. And he started to speculate as to why that was the case. And I think this goes along with some of the other smart observers I saw, which is a lot of smart observers are speculating that Blanche had an opportunity to do like a traditional white collar closing, right? Buttoned up. Here's the list of 7 things. They didn't prove reasonable doubt. It's not my job to give another theory, yada, 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 which perhaps would have been targeted right towards the lawyers who are in the jury. But instead, what Blanche did was throw haymakers and appeared to be giving the closing that Trump wanted him to give. This is what people are speculating, right? Is basically like the client here really wanted something that was not just for what was happening in the courtroom, but what was happening outside of the courtroom. And they also felt like Blanche left some defenses on the table, mainly this guy is sleazy, but he's not a criminal defense, which is the one that we speculated coming into this, which is we expected them to be like, look, this guy's paid off all these other people, right? And then a lot of this didn't happen during the campaign season. A lot of observers were surprised by how little of that actually showed up in this trial. And the rationale is very likely that Trump cares more about the campaign trail and his image outside of that courtroom than his image inside of the courtroom.
There's an argument for this strategy, which is that just what you said, which implicit in it is the assumption that there's likely going to be some kind of conviction. Even if it's on misdemeanor stuff, like one way or another, it's incredibly unlikely that they get out of there with a not guilty verdict across the board. And then if you are counting on the idea of a hung jury, well, that means you're counting on the idea, more than likely, of it being a juror who was already sympathetic to Trump going in. And if you're counting on the idea of a juror who's going to act like a Trump voter, then you give that juror the same things that you give a Trump voter, which is you say stuff that they can hang their hat on. It doesn't have to be particularly well reasoned. It doesn't have to, have all the T's crossed and the I's dotted. It's just enough for them to justify sticking with a belief that they would rather have as a belief rather than a logic-driven, reasoned argument. And the idea of saying, look, if you don't find Michael Cohen credible, then you can't convict. Well, that gives to someone who is looking for a reason something they can say over and over again in the jury room, which is, I don't find Cohen credible, and therefore I can't convict. You simplify it. You give them something very simple. It's the build a wall. Mexico's going to pay for it of closing arguments. It's, look, nobody really cares if this is true or doable, but it's justification you can use for voting the way that you want to vote anyway. So I think that's largely what's happening there.
Yeah, and Littman said there's one juror whose body language would concern him if he were the prosecutors. I don't know what that means, but that seems notable. But he said that same person seemed to be on it today and really attentive to the judge. I mean, again, I have no idea what any of this means. This is why it's like not being in that room is a real liability.
It's so hard when you have a jury. You can think you picked exactly right and then find out afterwards that the person you thought you were connecting with the whole time turned out didn't like you from the start and never. I mean, it's incredible.
Right. Well, I think the other thing here that's worth saying is that Blanche essentially went for a jury nullification argument, which for folks who don't know what that means, why don't you explain? Like, what's jury nullification? Then I'll explain why he.
Are you talking about what he said about prison time?
Yes.
Yeah. So he said during his closing that something along the lines of this could send this man to prison. And once the jury was out of the room, the judge reprimanded him and was saying, like, you know better than that. You know that you're not allowed to do that. The reason being that that's not to be considered by the not guilty or guilty phase of the trial. That's in New York. That's for the judge to do. And so you can prejudice the jury by introducing the consequences to the finding of fact, like something that doesn't belong in there. And yeah, so I think clearly that is him trying to create a situation where the judge says, well, now this jury pool is tainted and we have to do this all over again. And it looks like what the judge did instead is reprimand him and basically say, I know what you're trying to do. I'm not going to allow you to do it. But, but he was clearly very irritated with him.
Yeah. And I'm going to quote from Jonathan Alter, who had a good piece about this. He said, saying that was outrageous, Justice Merchan told Blanche after the jury left for lunch. Mentioning sentencing to gain sympathy with jurors who have no say in punishment is simply not allowed, he said, and that it was, quote, hard for me to imagine how that was not intentional, end quote. Alter goes on to say, the defense got more than a tongue lashing. After lunch, Merchan turned to the jurors and told them why they had to ignore this sneaky move. Not a good look for the defense. And then he went on to say, like, in the 3-hour closing argument, Blanche basically swung wildly in his words. And then again, like, we're going off of other people's sort of descriptions here. You got to think that that is not great for the Trump team, for the judge to be admonishing you to the jury as they're going to deliberations, because there's like different shades of what this hypothetical Trump warm person on that jury would be. If they're just a true MAGA head, nothing's going to matter. Mm-hmm. But if they're like, I kind of like this guy's chutzpah or whatever, but I'm not very political, they're spending all this time with the other jurors who think Trump is guilty, so they don't want to let those people down, right? You don't want to keep them there for many days. You probably respect the judge because this is an authority figure in your life over these few weeks. To have all that dynamic playing out,
yeah,
not great. And add to it the fact that the former president fell asleep during the jury instructions. Let's throw this tweet. This is, I think, a tweet from Harry Littman about this, if we have it.
To be fair, jury instructions are super boring.
For sure, right?
But you certainly, if you are the defense, you don't want the jury to go to deliberations with their last impression of the defense's case is, oh, you tried to trick me.
Yeah.
Because that's essentially what the judge saying, this thing that the defense counsel said in their closing argument, you are not allowed to consider that. That's not a good impression to send them off with at all. What I found really interesting, by the way, is you had sent a podcast that I listened to this morning that rested the whole thing. And I thought it was really brilliant and dramatic because in a trial, if you can create drama and excitement, people's brains turn on, especially. I was always taught that it's important to remember that the level of average attention that you are receiving from the jury during witness testimony, just on average, because the testimony is long and a lot of it is procedural and formulaic, and some stuff is like ceremonious, like sort of like authenticating chain of custody of documents, stuff like that gets really boring. And so if you can create moments of drama and excitement, you take them from a basic level of attention that is like watching television, but not like exciting television, just like I'm zoned out and I'm watching and my mind is going in and out, that kind of thing, and bring them to like reading a novel, right, where they're having to use more parts of their brain and focus. And so what the prosecutor, Steinglass, I think is his name, when he reenacted the phone call. So a big piece of the defense's closing argument is saying that when Michael Cohen is saying that he called Keith Schiller, Trump's bodyguard, and had a brief conversation with him, and then Trump was put on the phone and he talked to him about the hush money payment, that phone call was far too short for that to have happened. And because you can argue in closing arguments, Blanche was saying it's just impossible. You can't believe anything he said because could not have had that whole conversation in that amount of time. Well, the prosecutor then got out a cell phone, set a stopwatch, and reenacted how that phone call could have gone, and was able to do it in a way where it took half the time of the actual phone call, which if you're on the jury is a really exciting and dramatic moment, and also really undermines the credibility of the entire argument of the defense. And also to have an excuse as a lawyer to reenact a moment completely is like, it makes the jury feel like they saw it happen. And it's hard to come up with an excuse where a judge is going to allow you to do that. And they did clearly in that case.
Yeah. I think you take, and I think we now have this Littman tweet. You take what the Trump team, Blanche getting admonished with Trump being asleep, right? The picture I have in my head is a little bit of chaos on the Trump closing arguments. That's just the sense I have, compared to what seems to be a fairly buttoned up prosecution closing argument that also had a bit of drama to it, like that was of their own making, right? So if it is as it seems to be on paper, which is one team seemed organized, wasn't admonished, they get to go last, they brought some theatrics into it, they looked like they were very competent, the other team's getting admonished by the judge, the defendant's falling asleep, not the best way to close. You know what I'm saying? Like the combination of those two things. Again, if you have your MAGA person, it doesn't matter. But to the extent these are persuadable people, which is the whole point, is to assume that, because otherwise, what can you do? Then it seems like a good few days for the prosecution. Now, let's talk a little bit about jury instructions before we take a break here. So a couple of things, I was looking into this. One is, Mershon was reading out these jury instructions, which had some interesting pieces to them. But one thing I didn't realize is that in New York, you are barred as a jury from keeping copies of the guidance as you deliberate, which I can't even imagine what the public policy interest there is. You may have some theories as to why that isn't allowed. That seems odd. Then there are a couple other pieces here when it comes to the instructions. And I'll read some of these to you. He said, when you deliberate, you should do so with a view toward reaching an agreement, if that can be done without surrendering your individual judgment. So this gets to what I'm saying. The pressure is to reach an agreement. Then he explained the difference between motive and intent. He says that you have to set aside your personal differences. He says you can't speculate on how long the sentencing will be, which is obviously why Blanche really stepped in it. He says you can't hold it against Trump for not testifying. He says that you must prove beyond a reasonable doubt every element of the crime, which I think is really going to be key here. And they said that you can't convict Trump on Michael Cohen's testimony alone because he's an accomplice, but they could use his evidence if corroborated with other evidence. So I think this is really interesting.
Let me say something about the whole Blanche, introduction of the idea of prison time thing. Here's an alternative view as to why. I mean, we've talked about it as it's a mistake because the last thing that happens before they go to the jury room is possibly the feeling that defense did something outside the bounds. But Blanche knew that. He knew that would probably become part of the jury instructions. But what he's probably thinking is, one way or another, if I put that idea out there, they're going to think about that idea. And you might be, in a regular criminal trial, you don't have to worry about whether the jury understands that what's at stake could be incarceration for the defendant, because they're in a criminal trial, a felony is at stake. And I assume that most juries will assume that
I mean, you're there for
weeks.
Is a possibility. There's like all those charges.
In fact, a lot of times when folks don't end up sentenced after a guilty verdict to prison time, I bet juries are very surprised by it.
Right.
But in this case, what he may be thinking is, this jury may be thinking that, well, he was a former president, he's not going to prison. So it's, if we come up with a guilty verdict, so what? So he becomes a felon. And so it may simply be that what the defense is thinking is, I have to put this in their minds as a possibility. And what it reminds me of is there's a truly, I think, unjust rule on the civil side in cases with, and I think I mentioned this before, with railroad employees of the railroad, because they have their own separate law for when they get injured. And that is that because they're not allowed to take advantage of workers' compensation. And the problem is most juries assume that if you're in court suing because a railroad worker has been hurt, that the the person suing has already gotten workers' comp, when in fact they haven't. The only possibility they have of recovering anything is through a verdict for them in a trial. Well, you are, if you are the lawyer for them, you are barred from telling the jury that work comp does not apply to this worker. And I've always found that to be really unjust. I've always thought that the instruction should be, just so you know, workers' compensation does not apply, and the only recovery that this person could get is from this case. So it's sort of analogous, is that what the defense is thinking here is they're going to assume there's no way he can go to prison. So I've got to say it and put it in their mind so that as they are considering a guilty or not guilty verdict, that they're thinking about whether they want Trump to go to prison. So you can make an argument for it's good lawyering on his part, even if it is outside the bounds. It's good zealous advocacy.
Yeah, well, one other piece here is the prosecution, and this was in previous arguments over the jury instructions, got the judge to reject the defense's request that jurors be unanimous on which of the unlawful means Trump used to aid his election win. And as a reminder, what complicates this case is that it's not just a question of the business records fraud, but it was the fraud in service of another crime. And what Mershon said is you do not have to all agree on which of the other crimes he did, just that he was doing it in service of another crime, which seems notable because all of the all the legal people I've seen observing this case seem to think that it is open shut on the misdemeanor, the original. So the question is then, well, was it in service of another crime?
So here's, okay, all that said, let's look at what Trump thinks is going to happen. So we've got a couple of clips here. Let's go to the first one. This is Trump after the jury had received the instructions and went off to deliberate. This is what Trump said outside the courtroom today.
Thank you very much. I would say, in listening to the charges from the judge, who's, as you know, very conflicted and corrupt, because of the confliction, very, very corrupt. Mother Teresa could not beat these charges. These charges are rigged. The whole thing is rigged. The whole country's a mess between the borders and fake elections, and you have a trial like this where the judge is so conflicted he can't breathe. He's got to do his job. And it's not for me, that I can tell you. It's a disgrace. And I mean that. Mother Teresa could not beat those charges, but we'll see. We'll see how we do.
So that's the first bit of framing, is Trump is trying to make clear, you know, post-conviction, the message is going to be Mother Teresa would have been convicted here. This doesn't matter. This goes back to what we were saying earlier about giving the license, the permission slip to someone who wants to vote for Trump to dismiss this, right? Is to say, yeah, okay, well, he's a convicted felon, but it's not like a regular felony or a regular conviction because Mother Teresa would have been convicted of this. So now let's go to J.D. Vance, clearly getting the signal as to how to
grab
talk
the
about
baton.
this. Yeah. So here we go. Let's go to J.D. Vance talking about it.
I really hope Donald Trump gets acquitted, and if he does, it will be a miracle because of how loaded this judge has been from the start. And I think we got to ask some tough questions about whether his bias is actually motivated by his family's financial interest.
And you've sent a
What?
So now we're just setting
What's
up
the financial
conspiracy
interest?
that just I don't even know. It's who cares? Something. Jeremy says something about the daughter. Oh, because she like works at a Democratic consulting firm or something.
Oh.
You know. I mean, like, so therefore, the judge has to apparently find against all Republicans. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't matter. They are just setting it up as the judge. Now, never mind the fact that the judge would not be the one who finds him guilty.
Well, no, you know what's interesting, Jason? We have a topic later in this episode about family members being culpable for the sort of conduct of other family members, and it's actually a closer relative. At least in that case, they were under the same roof. So I'm sure the Republicans will be consistent on that. So when we get to that issue, I'm sure they will extend that culpability. But let's take a break, and when we come back,
can I before we go to the break, I want to pose one more thing, which is the politics of this we should speculate for a moment about how the politics of this play, or actually, I'll tee it up. When we come back from the break, let's talk about how the politics of this play. And so everybody stick around, and then we'll talk about that in a moment.
Now, I've been using this company called First Leaf for years, and I'm a wine lover, and this company is like a bit of a secret. It's the most personalized wine club I've ever seen. And what they allow you to do is discover new wines. And you start by just answering a few questions on their website about what flavors you like, how often you drink wine, if you prefer red, white, rosé. And based on your answers, they curate an amazing selection of wines for you. And I love that they come with these cards that tell you, basically it's like a cheat sheet about, what makes that wine what it is, why it tastes the way it is, what kind of food you might want to pair it with. And I've already had a bunch of shipments over the past few years from First Leaf, from Merlot to Pinot Noir to more sophisticated wines. And they basically learn what you like, and you learn what you like, and you start to develop like the vocabulary and the awareness around what you're drinking and what you're pairing it with. And then based on those preferences, your sort of palate expands and your options expand. Or if you want to be very basic, like I am sometimes on this, you could just stick with what you've got and kind of stick within your lane of more sort of simple wines. So I love this company, and being part of the First Leaf Wine Club also has its perks. You get to access their incredibly helpful wine concierge. So if you're doing a dinner party or whatever, they can help you pair things the way you need to pair them. So join the club today and discover new wines that you'll love with First Leaf. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/majority. That's try, tryfirstleaf.com/majority. That's tryfirstleaf.com/majority. Sick of the one-size-fits-all method, especially when it comes to your erectile dysfunctional treatment? Well, good news. Now you've got options with Hims. Hims is changing men's healthcare, providing access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. They provide access to doctor-trusted ED treatment options such as chewable hard mints, brand-name treatments like Viagra, or generic alternatives for up to 95% cheaper. The process is simple and 100% online. No uncomfortable doctor's visits. So answer a series of questions from their site, and a medical provider will determine the right treatment option. If prescribed, your medication ships to you for free. No insurance needed. So if ED is getting you down, it's time to join hundreds of thousands of trusted Hims subscribers and get treated. Start your free online visit today at hims.com/majority. That's Hims, HIMS.com/majority for your personalized ED treatment options. Hims.com/majority. Hard mints are chewable compounded products which are not approved or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate. Restrictions apply. See website for details and important safety information. Subscription required. Prices vary based on product and subscription plan.
All right, Ravi, you mentioned a moment ago Harry Litman, who is a former federal prosecutor who has a podcast called Talking Feds, and how he was in the courtroom, and he's been live tweeting it and commenting on it a lot. And so have a lot of other reporters. I actually did his podcast this week. I was a guest on Talking Feds this week, and it was interesting because Harry was asking, he was like, this has to move the polls. Like, I've been in the trial, it's been crazy. And it occurred to me that in the way people cover the election going forward, it is inescapable that any journalists who were in the room for this trial are going to have a hard time, in my opinion, maintaining perspective over how people are going to perceive at least the trial and the sort of Trump legal problems as opposed to the rest of us. And the reason for that is that if you think about it, what they saw is completely different to what the rest of America saw. They saw a porn star come into a room and sit across from a former president of the United States and talk about having sex with that former president, and it not being the most flattering of descriptions. Talk about that former president then paying them off. You have that former president's former lawyer come in and talk about all the different things they did together to be corrupt with regard to the porn star. My point is, once you have witnessed that, it is completely different than hearing about it. And it just, it leads me to say two things. One, while we talk about this, even with a conviction, I think we should be careful not to overestimate the power of this politically. And two, just a sliding doors thing. I honestly believe that had this trial been televised, Joe Biden would be up by 10 points right now, because everyone would watch this. It would go well beyond politics. It's a spectacle. It would be OJ level stuff, and it would capture the entire country's attention, and it would not look good for Trump.
Yeah, and I think there's this sense out there that Trump is Teflon and all this kind of stuff, and he's just going to turn this into an asset and all that. I don't share that view. Like, yes, do I think he will be able to spin it to his supporters? Yes. Like, do I think that there are even a lot of people in the middle who are going to be like, nothing here was surprising? But why I think it matters is twofold. One is, to the extent Trump has to explain this and talk about this, that's not what he wants to be talking about. And I think, like, as much as he wants to say I'm persecuted and all that, it's just an inconvenient series of information. And it will be distracting between now and the election day, trying to avoid having to spend time in a jail cell. Like, that's going to be a lot. And related to that too, I think that there is this middle who the Republicans, if you listen to them, they keep talking about the chaos, the Biden chaos and all that, which I don't know about you. I don't look around and see that chaos, which we could get to, but they want to say that, right? The world is in chaos. And obviously they point to things like international coverage of the conflict in Gaza and everything, and basically imply that this is somehow Biden's doing, right? And then they, obviously you heard it with Trump, they want to talk about the border and the border being chaos and all that. This gives the Biden team an opening to remind the voters about how chaotic Trump's term was, and to make a very strong case that this will be way more chaotic, because now, on top of everything else, you will be voting in a president who is fending off time in prison. And I think a combination of people not wanting to go through that drama, and also being embarrassed by the idea that their country would have such a person, is an opportunity. Now, is it as strong as like Dobbs? No. Like, is it as strong as the economic numbers and changing the perception that people seem to have that we're in a recession, which is just not true? No, those other things are going to factor in more, but this is chipping away at Trump's narrative.
The chaos argument is the best argument that the Trump campaign has, because absent reality, the fact is that every year the world feels more chaotic. Now, in some ways, the world is more chaotic, but really what it is we just know more about what's going on in the world all the time. With every passing year, we are inundated with more and more information, more and more outlets from which that information can come to us. So that, right now there's a war in Ukraine, there's a war in Israel, Palestine, and in the past, for a war to go on that long, I mean, just if you think about how the war in Afghanistan went on for 20 years, because things could fade from people's imagination. Things could fade, and this was, in my opinion, not a good thing, by the way, but it could fade, and people could just go about their lives. And it is, I believe, more and more difficult, and in some ways that's positive, for people to look away from what's going on in the world. And as a result, things seem scarier. Things seem more chaotic. It's sort of like how in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't actually an increase in the amount of abductions of children, but they were covered with so obsessively by the news that people started to believe by the 90s that this was happening at an epidemic level that wasn't happening prior. And so they have that going for them. And the reason they have that going for them, and the reason it's such a big deal, is because there's no doubt that Biden ran on the idea that it'll be not chaotic compared to Trump. And I think clearly it has been far less chaotic by leaps and bounds than Trump. But people have short attention spans and short memories. So I do think it's important to remind them of that. But what I would want to get across to everybody as we wait on this verdict is that one thing I've learned both in politics and in life is that there's no actual such thing as shortcuts. There just isn't. if you really want something, you're going to have to do the hard work to get it. And it's not going to happen in such a way where, let's say he gets found guilty on every count. There's just not going to be that many people whose vote it changes. It's just not going to work that way, because at the end of the day, that's not what people care about. And this is going to be an election that is more like a generic Republican versus Democrat election than we've ever had. These are two candidates who are completely known quantities to the American people. They know exactly what they're getting for the most part from both of them. They've heard all sorts of bad things about both of them now, which is why the Republicans have run this whole Biden crime family thing to mitigate or to, make everything messy and make it seem like everything's the same. And ultimately, we will win or lose based on whether people would rather have Republican ideas or Democratic ideas. And there's just no getting around the hard work that's going to have to be done, no matter the result of this trial, in my opinion.
Well, okay, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about this Alito controversy and a couple other issues if we have time.
Typical children's vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk growing kids should never eat. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin. While most children's vitamins are filled with 5 grams of sugar and can contribute to a variety of health issues, Hiya is made with 0 sugar and 0 gummy junk, yet it tastes great and it's perfect for picky eaters, i.e. kids. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste that they love. Formulated with the help of nutritional experts, Hiya is pressed with a blend of 12 organic fruits and veggies, then supercharged with 15 essential vitamins and minerals, including vitamin D, B12, C, zinc, folate, and many others to help support immunity, energy, brain function, mood, concentration, teeth, bones, and more. It's non-GMO, vegan, dairy-free, allergy-free, gelatin-free, nut-free, and everything else that you can imagine. Hiya is designed for kids of all ages and sent straight to your door so parents have one less thing to worry about. As you know, I'm a father, and I'm always on the lookout for the best possible vitamins for my child to take. I'm so happy that I've come across Hiya Health. The ingredients are amazing, and I don't have to worry about sugar or gummy junk because Hiya Health is made without that stuff and is still able to keep the great taste, which is super important because that's how you get kids to eat it. We've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/majority. This deal is not available on the regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/majority and get your kids the full body nourishment that they need to grow into healthy adults.
All right. Well, Alito, right? So we talked about the upside down flag. Shortly after that episode, it came out that there was another insurrectionist type flag that had been flying outside of their beach house in New Jersey. It's called the Appeal to Heaven flag. Then Jodi Kantor published an article in the New York Times this week contradicting what Alito said about the timeline of how they talk to their neighbors, and essentially doesn't make Mrs. Alito look great. She seems like truly unhinged and picking fights with her neighbors. The neighbors, to their credit, were pretty candid about the mistakes they made in this engagement, which, neither of them are Supreme Court justices or married to them. So I don't really care what the neighbors are doing. But there's a lot of details there that are really sad. And honestly, not worth going into probably, but I think if you read the piece, what you're left with is that Alito is less than candid about the timeline. Basically, a lot of the stuff that happened between Mrs. Alito and the neighbor and all that happened after this flag was up. And so it doesn't seem to explain it. And the neighbors couldn't see this flag. It wasn't like it was posited as like some kind of message to the neighbors they're having a dispute with. But the sort of physics of the block apparently made it such that argument wasn't totally candid. Like the lawyers were, the neighbors were saying, we didn't even see it until later because we don't have a good view of it. So this idea that this was some kind of message sent to the neighbor seems strange. But maybe I'll pause there because then we have this letter from Alito, which is even bigger news. But maybe I'll pause there.
Well, I'll just say, I would love to know, just out of curiosity, what started this conflict with the neighbors in the first place, because it's possible. I mean, Alito claims that they put up a yard sign that said something about Mrs. Alito personally, which
There's
I
no
have no
evidence of that.
problem. Well,
There's
but
no
I have no
evidence.
problem believing that happened. It just, based on the timeline, it appears that happened after this flag was flown inverted. And
the sign said F Trump, and then they also said you are complicit or something, but it wasn't, and it wasn't like
okay.
Alito's are complicit.
So she interpreted it to be about her.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I guess at some point she ran after their car, Mrs. Alito did, and spit on them, spit at their car. Anyway, just a sidebar, Ravi, have you ever been a part of like a neighbor dispute, like even when you were a kid?
Yes, actually. So I was just talking about this with my mom, who listens, so she's probably not going to love this. I got my brother got arrested. You remember this? Actually, if you probably don't remember this, when my brother was on this podcast, he talked about it. He got arrested for something I did to our neighbor.
Oh,
basically,
yeah,
I like threw a light bulb at my neighbor's house when I was a kid. And they thought it was my brother, so they arrested my brother. We had like a big like Hatfield and McCoy's thing going on in my neighborhood. And I recently was trying to talk my mom into letting it go 30 years later, and I was like, look, I was the one who was wrong. I was explaining to her. I was like, and she really didn't want to see Pat. And they've now moved. They just moved this year. And I'm like, can we just, I really wanted us to like go. There was a part of me that just wanted to knock on my neighbor's door and be like, hey, I'm really sorry. Like I was so terrible. So if the Guerreros, if you're listening, I apologize. But my mom's not gonna like that apology. But
but here's the reason I ask is because the lower the stakes and the more local the conflict, the more intense stuff gets. And this is why, as troubling and problematic as Nextdoor is, the app, it can be addictive to scroll through. Yeah. And it's why when you think about, like, I remember, my younger brother got in trouble in our neighborhood, and so did I growing up. And so there were, I would say most generously, we had some of our greatest friends in the world who were neighbors, but we also had neighbors who I would describe as rival, in the way that they regarded my parents. So I remember all that, but I also remember things like in politics when my first campaign, when I ran for the state legislature, the most intense meeting, maybe even to this day, one of the top 5 and most intense meetings I've ever been in politics, was about whether a dog park would be put in a neighborhood. And when I tell you that it was one of the top 5, I spent a lot of time in Ferguson as Secretary of State, and this was up there, right? So, and it reminds me of like, youth sports arguments that happen between different sets of parents during, games. So anyway, the lower the stakes, the more intense the passions. And so I just want to step back for a moment. It's kind of funny to me that is the center of this controversy about a Supreme Court justice potentially, or being asked anyway, to recuse themselves.
Well, now, by the way, there's no story about her being in a dispute with the neighbors in Jersey, right? Like either one of
where the other flag was.
Either they're less than candid, Jason, or she really likes to fight with her neighbors. And honestly, I'm willing
both
to
are true.
I'm willing to believe.
I think both are true. I think she's probably an incredibly difficult neighbor. You got to remember, this is a person who has enjoyed that Washington societal life without any of the traditional scrutiny that comes with it, because the Alitos are on the Supreme Court. So you get to do all of the Washington things, but you don't have to, deal with reporters. You don't have to deal with that kind of thing. So, and that I think would give you the status of a regular politician, but without the opportunity to develop the thicker skin. So that's how we end up here. Now, on the timeline, clearly from what the neighbors are saying about them seeing the flag, and it being well before this dispute with her, clearly they're lying about it being in response to the neighbor. And also, Tim Miller had a great tweet where he was like, yeah, obviously, anytime I get in an argument with someone, the first thing I do is I go home and I invert the American flag. I mean, it's such an absurd argument. And even if you take it as it's in response to them, okay, if it's in response to a political statement they made, then it is a political statement that she made in return. Now,
Yeah.
to be consistent, he is saying, I asked her to take it down and she refused. If that's true, you know, people listening won't like this. I don't think it would be fair to expect a Supreme Court justice to recuse themselves because of the political beliefs of their spouse. The problem here is that there is no evidence whatsoever, even in his opinions, in his conduct, in anything, that he doesn't share her views. There's just no evidence of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reading his letter now. It's very lawyerly. He says he goes through each of the sort of incidents here. He says, as I've stated, and by the way, for people listening, he has sent a lawyer now on official letter, a letter on official letterhead saying he will not recuse. It's addressed to Dick Durbin and Sheldon Whitehouse, and it was in response to a letter that Durbin and Whitehouse sent to him. And he talks about the first incident. He said, as I have stated publicly, I had nothing whatsoever to do with the flying of that flag. I was not even aware of the upside down flag until it was called to my attention. As soon as I saw it, I asked my wife to take it down, but for several days she refused, which is interesting. And that's very sad. I would say, if he would be entitled to the benefit of the doubt if it were one flag, one place, but this flag plus the other flag, the appeal to heaven one, I think starts to rise to the level of a ton of circumstantial evidence. He talks about that flag. He says, I recall that my wife did fly that flag for some period of time, but I do not remember how long it flew. And what is most relevant here, I had no involvement in the decision to fly that flag. So everything he just said about the upside down flag is almost irrelevant now, because he's like, I didn't know. Well, you did know about this other one. So if you asked your wife to take down that one, you didn't ask her to take down this other one. So now the question is, should we care that your family was flying this flag, right? Because it's a lot of words on this page, but none of them matter when at least one of those flags you admit you knew about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now you're flying a flag. That flag at a house you own is a flag. Now we have two flags at two houses that you own. At least one of them you admit you knew and did not ask her to take down. That have a very specific meaning that is relevant to cases that you're presiding over. He's saying he does not need to recuse himself over that. I think he definitely does. And I also think that he deserves, we as an American people deserve an explanation from him as to what he thinks about January 6th. I truly believe that he should tell us. I would love to see him say or write, hey, I believe in the peaceful transfer of power. What happened on January 6th was appalling to me. To anybody who is concerned that I harbor any beliefs that was some kind of like just cause, be assured I do not. That would be great. Honestly, I would be considerably less animated about this if he at least went out of his way to say that. You know?
Agreed. Here's what I take away from this. Obviously, none of that's going to happen, unfortunately. What is going to happen is he's not going to recuse himself. He will be on the bench when any of this is heard. And what we have to keep in mind is that Alito is he's not a conservative justice. He is a Republican justice. He is a partisan. If you look at, as somebody pointed out the other day, I can't remember who it was, but they pointed out that if you look at Justice Thomas, for instance, there are times when he writes conservative opinions and comes to conservative conclusions that are not necessarily in line with the Republican Party. Whereas Justice Alito, 100% of his decisions are just in line with the Republican Party. He's no different than a member of Congress who finds a reason to justify always being in step with Trump and the Republican Party. And what we have to do is recognize how important it is that we win this election when you have, I think, 3 justices that are coming close to the age where they would potentially retire, and you don't want Trump in a position to appoint them, to appoint the replacements. And then B, keeping in mind what we talked about last week, which is there is an opportunity because of these kind of shenanigans, for Biden to not have to run, and you've talked about this a lot, Ravi, the traditional incumbent campaign where you try and convince everybody that everything is amazing and you can't run against anything, against the system as it is, because with the Supreme Court being so firmly in the hands of extremists on the right, you are, as an incumbent president running for re-election, running against an incumbent party in the Supreme Court, at least. And that is something that I think we should keep in mind.
Yeah. Makes sense. All right. One for us. What's happening out there in Missouri?
Let's see. Our power went out for a few days, so we were at my parents' house, which was really fun, actually. And this week, so the two things that were kind of fun. One, I got to take my kids to the neighborhood where I grew up, and when they actually convinced me to knock on the door of the house I grew up in, and the folks had heard that I had lived there, I guess, and so they brought us in. And it was totally surreal to go into my childhood home. We lived there until I was 17.
How far is that from where you live now?
It's about 20-25 minutes.
Oh, wow.
And but what was, it was really cool. Like, we went to see some neighbors that are still there.
Now, did you grow up on the Kansas side?
Yeah, I grew up in Shawnee on the Kansas side. So, and so, True also got to spend the week like doing Shawnee things. Like, he found turtles and all the stuff I did growing up. But it was cool. I got to take a photo. Diana was out of town, so it was the three of us, and I got to take a photo of me and Bella and True standing in the spot in that house where I first kissed their mom.
Oh my God.
Which was pretty wild. But anyway, so that was fun. But then the other really funny thing that happened this week is yesterday, the neighbors down the street, they had a lemonade stand, and True, who's, mine and Diana's kid, went over and was like, I'll get you some customers, because they were doing what you do with a lemonade stand, kind of passively sitting there waiting for cars to stop. And so True starts flagging down cars and going to other houses and bringing people out to the lemonade stand. And then he's like, all right, well, I should get a cut. And they're like, well, no, it's our lemonade. And True's like, I need a commission. And they're like, no. And it wasn't like, they're all very close, these kids. So it wasn't like a real argument. So True's like, well, I'm setting up a competing business. And he goes 2 doors down to our house, and he pulls out a card table, and he goes inside, and he gets like copies of the children's book that he and I wrote, and a Sharpie, and like some pretzel chips, a bag of pretzel chips. He starts putting them in plastic cups, and he starts a rival business. And it was a book signing. He's like flagging down cars and being like, I wrote this children's book. I'll sign it for you for $10. And anyway, in an hour, the kid made $100.
No.
It was hilarious.
Get out of here.
Anyway, it was just really
$100 an hour. That's not bad.
Yeah. Anyway, what about you?
Yesterday I had on the Lost Debate podcast, I had Amanda Knox on the podcast, which was really interesting. And it was one of my favorite episodes we've ever done. Actually, it's 2 weeks in a row.
Refresh people's memory. She the person who was like
she was in Italy studying abroad. Yeah. She was accused of murdering her roommate, and very much did not murder her roommate. And there's a great Netflix documentary about it for people who want to go down that rabbit hole. But the reason why I had her on is because she recently retracted her defense of somebody else who was unjustly accused. So I found it really interesting. It was like an example of somebody truly changing their mind about something that was very high stakes. And it really put her at risk within the innocence community, because like the idea of saying somebody is guilty that you had been advocating for is like a very like difficult step and rare step within that community. And so I had her on to talk about why she felt like this guy who she'd been defending for so long actually did the crime. And it was riveting stuff. I mean, it was like one of my favorite episodes we've ever done. So people can go to Lost Debate and listen to that. It was really cool. Yeah.
Well, I'll go listen to that. I also haven't had a chance yet to listen to your new series, Killing Justice, but I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, yeah. I've been very busy on the pod front lately. Yeah, we launched Killing Justice on Monday, the first 2 episodes. So people should go subscribe to that. This is the podcast that I've been working on in India about a murder of a judge there. And we've been surging. We're now like, I think the, 30-something ranked true crime podcast in the country and 150th overall ranked podcasts in the country.
It's awesome.
So and that's just after the first couple of days. So we've been surging. And I went on Pod Save the World this week to talk about it with Ben, and that dropped this morning. So yeah, a lot of podding this week.
And if you count today's episode, what we talked about, it's all true crime stuff. So
there you go. It is true crime. That is for sure.
All right. You can find us at Jason Kander everywhere and at Ravi M. Gupta everywhere. Please leave a 5-star review. Thank you to the Midas Mighty. Remember, we all have a platform. Make sure to use yours today.